Have you ever woken up and felt like the whole world was already moving faster than you could catch up? The alarm goes off, your phone lights up, messages are waiting, the weight of yesterday's worries comes flooding back before your feet even touch the floor. It's in that fragile moment, between dreaming and doing, that most of us hand over our peace without even realizing it. But imagine this. What if, instead of rushing, you allowed yourself a single pause? A breath so soft and yet so powerful that it set the tone for your entire day. A breath that whispered, "You are alive, you are here, and you have the power to shape how this day unfolds." That is where transformation begins, not with dramatic resolutions or punishing schedules, but with the smallest act of awareness. One breath, one intention. One step into the present moment. Buddhist wisdom has always taught us that life is not changed by massive leaps we can't sustain. It's sculpted by subtle practices repeated with care. Like drops of water carving a stone, the ordinary rituals of waking, moving, breathing, and reflecting shape who we become. We don't need to chase after an ideal version of ourselves. We need only to meet the life that is already here. And in that meeting, we quietly improve day by day. And here is the most freeing truth. You don't have to be anyone else. You don't have to be the perfect meditator, or the most disciplined, or the calmest soul in the room. You simply have to be willing. Willing to pause when you normally react. Willing to choose kindness when anger feels easier. Willing to soften into gratitude when the mind wants to complain. Think of it like standing before a river. The current of habit and distraction will always try to pull you downstream, but the teachings of the Buddha and the practices born from them are like stepping stones laid gently across the water. Each step might feel small, so small you almost dismiss it, but taken together, they carry you to the other side. This isn't about self-improvement in the way the world usually defines it. It's not about polishing yourself into some flawless version, chasing endless productivity, or becoming someone others admire. No, this is about self-return, coming back to your own true nature, which is already whole, already enough, already radiant beneath the dust of distraction. And so, in the minutes ahead, we'll walk together through 7 simple practices, anchors for your day, seeds for your growth. They don't require money, they don't demand hours, they simply ask for presence, a willingness to notice, a willingness to live awake rather than asleep. But before we step onto that path, pause for just a moment. Feel the breath in your chest, the rhythm of your heart, the simple fact that you are alive right now, listening. That aliveness is the most sacred gift you have. And from this gift, everything else unfolds. As we move forward, I invite you to listen not just with your mind, but with your whole being. Let the words sink like gentle rain, watering the soil of your everyday life. Because true change doesn't come from forcing, it comes from remembering. Remembering who you are, remembering what matters, and remembering that every single day is an invitation to return home to yourself. So let us begin this journey, not in haste, not in pressure, but in stillness. A quiet beginning that holds within it the promise of transformation. The first light of morning holds a secret that most of us overlook. It doesn't shout, it doesn't demand. It simply whispers, an invitation to begin again. Yet too often, before we even notice the softness of that invitation, we've already traded it for the noise of alarms, the glow of screens, and the weight of yesterday's unfinished tasks. But what if you didn't rush? What if the very first thing you offered yourself was stillness? A pause so quiet that it shifted the entire rhythm of your day. Picture this: you open your eyes, and instead of reaching for your phone, you place a hand gently on your chest. You feel your breath rise and fall, steady and patient. You whisper inwardly, "I am alive. This day is a gift." That single moment, though it lasts only a few seconds, creates a ripple far greater than you realize. Because the state in which you begin your morning often becomes the state in which you live your day. In Buddhist practice, the morning is sacred. It's seen as the fertile ground where seeds of mindfulness can be planted. The world hasn't yet crowded in with its demands. Your mind hasn't yet been scattered by countless distractions. In this space, even a few minutes of silence can open the door to clarity. And silence here doesn't mean emptiness in the dull sense. It means fullness, the fullness of presence, the fullness of hearing birds outside your window, of feeling the coolness of the morning air, of sensing your own body stretching into wakefulness. This is the silence that nourishes. Some people find this presence by sitting quietly with eyes closed, letting each breath be like the turning of a page. Others find it by stepping outside, letting sunlight touch their skin, grounding themselves with the earth beneath their feet. And for some, it's as simple as sipping a cup of tea slowly, not as a task to complete, but as a ritual to savor. It doesn't matter how you choose to begin. What matters is the quality of attention you bring to that beginning. Because the truth is, you're not just starting a morning, you're setting the tone for how you'll meet everything that follows. Think of a musician tuning their instrument before a concert. If the strings are tight, the sound will be harsh. If they are loose, the melody will falter. But when the instrument is tuned with care, even the simplest notes carry beauty. You are that instrument. Your morning presence is the tuning. And here's what's truly remarkable. You don't need an hour-long meditation to change your day. Even 5 minutes of calm breathing can rewire the way you respond to challenges. Imagine facing traffic, emails, or unexpected frustrations, not with irritation, but with the same calm that anchored you in the morning. That is the power of starting with stillness. There's a story of a young student who once asked his teacher, "Why must I meditate every morning? I barely have time." The teacher smiled and replied, "When a warrior goes to battle, do they sharpen their sword after the fight begins or before?" The student understood. The morning is your sharpening, not for combat with others, but for the subtle battles within, impatience, distraction, fear. So tomorrow, when you wake, resist the urge to rush. Give yourself the gift of silence, even if it's brief. Let your breath become your anchor, your body your temple, and your awareness your guide. In that quiet beginning, you'll discover something profound. Peace is not waiting at the end of the day as a reward. It is available right here, at the very start. And as this calm presence roots itself in you, it naturally leads to something even more powerful. The ability to live your day guided not by accident or chaos, but by intention. When your morning begins in stillness, something beautiful happens. You create space. And in that space, a question naturally arises. How do I wish to live this day? Most of us carry around endless lists, things to do, roles to play, goals to reach. But the Buddha taught that clarity does not come from adding more, it comes from subtracting. Instead of scattering your energy across a dozen directions, choose one. One intention to guide you like a compass, steady and clear, no matter where the day takes you. An intention is not a rigid goal. It isn't about controlling outcomes. It's more like planting a seed in the soil of your awareness. If you water it with attention, it shapes the way you move, the way you speak, the way you see. And what makes it powerful is its simplicity. Imagine beginning your day with just one vow. Today, I will meet others with kindness. Suddenly, every interaction becomes part of that practice. The driver who cuts you off in traffic, the colleague who interrupts you, the child who won't listen. Each moment becomes a chance to honor your intention. You may stumble, you may forget, but the seed remains, pulling you back gently, reminding you who you chose to be today. Or maybe your intention is even simpler. Today, I will return to my breath whenever I feel lost. Just that. And every time the world tries to carry you away in its rush, you find yourself remembering, my breath, and you return. Think of it like walking through a forest. Without an intention, you may wander aimlessly, distracted by every turn, every noise, every shadow. But with a single guiding star, every step has direction. The forest doesn't change, but the way you move through it does. There was once a story told of a monk who, each morning, wrote a single word on a piece of paper and placed it in his pocket. That word was his anchor. Some days it was patience. Some days it was truth. Other days it was simply love. Whenever his mind grew cloudy or restless, he reached into his pocket, touched the paper, and remembered. He said it was like carrying a lantern in the dark. It didn't light up the whole road, but it was enough to see the next step. That's the power of one intention. It doesn't solve everything. It doesn't erase struggle, but it gives you a way to meet struggle without losing yourself. And here's something profound. Your intention doesn't need to be lofty. It doesn't need to sound spiritual or poetic. Sometimes the most practical words carry the deepest wisdom. Listen more. Speak gently. Finish what I start. These small anchors, lived with sincerity, can transform the ordinary into something extraordinary. So tomorrow, when you sit in your morning stillness, ask yourself, not with pressure, but with openness, what matters most to me today? Listen quietly. A word, a phrase, a feeling will rise. Hold it lightly, like a flame in your palm. Then carry it with you, letting it guide how you meet the world. Because when you live with a single intention, your day is no longer just a series of events, it becomes a practice. And that practice, repeated again and again, is how you quietly become the person you've always longed to be. And as you walk with intention, you'll soon notice something else. Not all of your habits are in harmony with the life you wish to live. Some of them run on autopilot, pulling you back into old patterns. To truly grow, you must learn the art of breaking free from these unconscious cycles. As you walk through your day with intention, something else becomes clear. Not all of your patterns are serving you. Some of them, in fact, are quietly draining your energy, keeping you stuck in the same loops day after day. Think about how many of your actions unfold automatically. The way your hand reaches for your phone before you've even opened your eyes. The way irritation rises in your chest before you've even processed what someone said. The way you eat, not because you're hungry, but because you're bored or restless. These are unconscious habits, running beneath awareness, shaping your reality without asking your permission. Buddhism teaches us that suffering is born not from who we are, but from the patterns we repeat. And here's the liberating truth: you are not broken. Your patterns are, and patterns can be changed. Imagine a man walking down the same street every day. At the center of the road, there is a deep hole. Each morning, he falls into it, climbs out with difficulty, and promises himself he'll remember tomorrow. But the next day, he forgets. Again and again, he falls. One day, finally, he chooses a different path. The hole remains, but it no longer controls his life. This is what it means to break a pattern. It doesn't require dramatic change. It begins with awareness. The moment you catch yourself reaching for that phone, reacting with anger, numbing with distraction, that pause is the opening. And in that opening, you can choose differently. Try this. If your habit is to wake and scroll, replace it with sitting in silence for 2 minutes. If your habit is to meet tension with anger, breathe once before speaking. If your habit is to fill every moment with noise, experiment with doing less and being more. Small interruptions have power. They create space for something new to emerge. They remind you that life is not a treadmill you're trapped on. It's a path you can step off, redirect, reshape. Buddhism explains this through the teaching of dependent origination. Everything arises because of conditions. Your reactions, your cravings, your anxieties, they're not random. They are the result of patterns. And because they're conditioned, they can be reconditioned. Let me share a story. There was once a young novice monk who confessed to his teacher, "Master, I feel trapped. Every time I meditate, my mind races. I get frustrated, I scold myself, and then I quit early. I think I'm just not meant for this path." The master smiled and said, "It is not you who is failing, it is your habit of fighting the mind. Each time the thought comes, you add more struggle by pushing it away. This is the pattern. So instead of fighting, bow to the thought, acknowledge it and let it pass like a cloud." The novice tried this, and over time, the storm inside grew gentler. Not because his mind stopped producing thoughts, but because he stopped feeding the old pattern. He didn't break himself, he broke the habit. That's the essence of growth. You do not need to punish yourself into becoming better. You need only to step out of the unconscious loops that no longer serve you. Each small shift is a doorway into freedom. And here's the beauty. Once you begin breaking these patterns, you realize something profound. It's not about how much time you spend on change, it's about the quality of your energy when you choose differently. We often believe that the secret to a better life is time, more hours in the day, more control over our schedule, more discipline to fit it all in. But here's the truth. It's not time that determines the quality of your life. It's energy. Think about it. You can have an entire free afternoon, yet feel too drained to enjoy it. Or you can have just 10 minutes, but if your energy is alive, clear, and focused, those 10 minutes can change everything. Time is fixed, we all get the same 24 hours. But energy is fluid. It rises, it falls, it expands, it contracts. And when you learn to care for it, you multiply the value of every moment you live. Buddhism reminds us that the body, the mind, and the heart are not separate. They are deeply intertwined. When your body is neglected, your mind grows restless. When your emotions are heavy, your energy sinks, no matter how much sleep you've had. This is why managing energy requires a holistic view, not just scheduling tasks on a calendar. Consider how you begin your day. If you rush into it with stress, you spend energy before you've even earned it. But if you root yourself in stillness and intention, as we've explored, you generate energy instead of depleting it. Like a tree drawing nourishment from deep roots, you rise with strength that carries you through the hours ahead. Energy is also shaped by the people and environments you surround yourself with. Some conversations leave you lighter, inspired, alive. Others drain you, even if no harsh word was spoken. Pay attention to this. Your energy is like a flame. It grows brighter when it's protected, but it flickers when exposed to too much wind. Guard it with awareness. And here's a shift that can transform your life. Instead of asking, "How much time do I have for this?" begin asking, "What kind of energy do I need for this?" Suddenly, your perspective changes. A difficult task may not require hours, it may require a rested mind. A deep conversation may not require planning, it may require an open heart. There's a teaching in Zen: when you are walking, walk. When you are eating, eat. It sounds simple, but within it lies the essence of energy management. When you are fully present in each act, you conserve energy. But when your attention is divided, eating while scrolling, walking while worrying, you leak energy without realizing it. Presence is not just a spiritual practice. It is the most practical way to protect your vitality. Think of your energy as currency. Would you spend all your money on things that don't matter, leaving nothing for what truly does? Of course not. Yet many of us spend our energy this way, scattered on distractions, consumed by habits that don't serve us, leaving little for what brings real joy. Imagine instead aligning your energy with your values, feeding your body with rest and nourishment, feeding your mind with clarity and focus, feeding your spirit with silence, compassion, and gratitude. This is how you stop living by exhaustion and start living by renewal. And the more you honor your energy, the more you realize something extraordinary. Growth doesn't come from doing more. It comes from doing less, but with your whole being present. This awareness naturally guides us into another practice, learning how to let go of what weighs us down. Because no matter how carefully you protect your energy, if you are still carrying the burdens of the past, that energy will be drained before you even begin. No matter how carefully you guard your energy, it will always be drained if your space, inside or outside, is cluttered. Clutter doesn't just sit on a shelf or pile up in a drawer. It lives in the mind, it seeps into the body, it clouds the heart. And often, without even noticing, we carry the weight of things we no longer need. Look around your physical space. The stacks of papers untouched for months. The clothes you never wear. The objects you keep just in case, though years have passed without them serving you. Every item is not just physical, it is energetic. It demands a small piece of your attention, a fragment of your awareness. And over time, these fragments add up, leaving you restless without knowing why. Now, look inward. How many old stories do you replay in your mind? How many grudges, regrets, or unspoken words do you store in the corners of your heart? Just like clutter in a room, these inner fragments take up space. They steal energy that could otherwise flow into the present moment, into creativity, into peace. Buddhism teaches us the importance of emptiness, not as a void, but as a freedom. When you let go of what no longer serves you, you are not losing, you are creating space. Space for new breath, space for new joy, space for new beginnings. There is a practice in Zen temples. Monks clean their surroundings daily, not as a chore, but as meditation. Sweeping the floor is sweeping the mind. Washing the bowl is washing away distraction. Every act of cleaning outside is also cleansing inside. It is a reminder that the outer and inner worlds are not separate, they reflect one another. Try this yourself. Begin small. Open one drawer and release what you no longer need. As you let go, notice the lightness in your body. Then, turn inward. When an old memory arises, instead of clutching it, bow to it gently and let it go. You are not erasing the past, you are simply clearing the dust so your true self can shine. And here's the beauty. Cleanliness is not perfection. It's not about sterile spaces or spotless thoughts. It's about flow. When your environment flows, your mind flows. When your heart is uncluttered, your energy is free. Imagine waking up in a room where everything has its place, where light enters freely, where the air feels open. Imagine beginning your day with a mind that isn't burdened by yesterday's worries. That feeling, that clarity, is what arises when you clean both inside and out. And once you taste this freedom, you realize something profound. Letting go of clutter, whether physical or emotional, is not an act of loss. It is an act of love. Love for yourself, for your future, for the life you are still creating. And when that space opens, something even more powerful emerges, the ability to live with gratitude. because gratitude thrives best in an uncluttered heart. When your space, inside and out, has been cleared, something beautiful happens. You begin to see yourself more clearly. And in that clarity, a question arises: how do I care for this life I've been given? Many people hear the word discipline and think of rigidity, punishment, or cold self-control. But in truth, discipline is not about forcing yourself. It's about loving yourself enough to create structure that protects what matters most. Think of it this way: when a gardener builds a fence, it is not to trap the flowers, but to protect them from harm. Discipline is that fence. It shields your energy, your intentions, your growth from the weeds of distraction and the storms of impulse. Buddhism reminds us that the middle path is the way of balance, not indulgence, not deprivation. True discipline lives in this balance. It is the gentle strength that says, I will honor my body by resting when it needs rest and moving when it needs movement. I will honor my mind by feeding it wisdom, not noise. I will honor my spirit by returning again and again to silence, even when the world pulls me away. Discipline is not the voice that scolds you when you stumble. It is the hand that lifts you back up and says, try again, with kindness. Consider a monk rising before dawn to meditate. At first glance, it may look like sacrifice. But if you look deeper, you'll see something else. Love. Love for clarity. Love for awakening. Love for a life lived fully, not wasted in forgetfulness. The early rising is not punishment, it is devotion. And the same is true for you. Whether it's keeping a promise to exercise, choosing nourishing food, setting aside time for reflection, or limiting distractions, these are not acts of restriction. They are acts of love. Each moment of discipline whispers, I care about the person I am becoming. Imagine discipline not as chains, but as wings. With every consistent act, you rise a little higher above old habits. With every small choice repeated, you strengthen the muscle of freedom. And here's the paradox. When you see discipline as love, it no longer feels heavy. It becomes light. It becomes joyful, because you realize you are not obeying a set of rules. You are honoring your own well-being. And from this place of love, something else begins to unfold: the ability to forgive yourself when you fall short. Because even discipline, rooted in compassion, understands that growth is not linear. This understanding leads us into our next reflection: the quiet strength found in self-forgiveness, the kind that allows you to rise again, no matter how many times you've fallen. As the day draws to a close, there is a sacred doorway that often goes unnoticed: the quiet moments before sleep. Too many of us rush into the night, carrying with us the noise of the day, the weight of unfinished tasks, the echo of old worries. We collapse into bed, hoping rest will wash it all away. But rest cannot heal what we never pause to acknowledge. This is why reflection at the end of the day is so powerful. It is not about judgment or harsh self-criticism. It is about meeting yourself gently with honesty and compassion before the night carries you into dreams. Buddhist practice often encourages this, to look back on the day not with regret but with awareness. To ask simple questions: how did I live today? Did I honor my intention? Did I act from love or from fear? Where did I stumble? Where did I shine? These questions are not meant to burden you. They are lanterns, illuminating the path you have walked, showing you clearly where your feet have touched the earth. And when you see the path, you gain the power to walk it differently tomorrow. Imagine sitting quietly at the edge of your bed, the lights dim, the world slowing down. You close your eyes and take a few gentle breaths. You replay the day like watching clouds drift across the sky, moments of joy, moments of tension, moments of stillness. You see them, you acknowledge them, and then you let them pass. And if you find mistakes, do not cling to them. Instead, bow to them. Say softly, I forgive you, tomorrow we begin again. That forgiveness is not weakness, it is the soil in which growth takes root. Reflection before sleep is also an invitation to gratitude, to notice even the smallest blessings: the meal you ate, the smile you received, the breath that carried you through another day. Gratitude softens the heart, releasing the mind from its restless grip, and prepares the spirit for true rest. In Zen tradition, the end of the day is often seen not as closure, but as continuation. The way you fall asleep shapes the way you awaken. If you end the day in agitation, you awaken already exhausted. But if you end it in clarity and peace, you rise with renewed energy. Reflection, then, is not just about today, it is also about tomorrow. So tonight, before you surrender to sleep, give yourself the gift of presence. even just 5 minutes. Breathe, reflect, forgive, be grateful, then let go, because tomorrow a new day awaits, and you will meet it not as a prisoner of yesterday, but as someone free to begin again. And when you live this way, day after day, reflection after reflection, you begin to see a larger pattern. That life itself is a cycle of beginnings and endings, of birth and death, of holding on and letting go. Understanding this cycle is the doorway into the deepest wisdom of all. Sometimes wisdom is best carried not in abstract teachings, but in stories. Stories touch the heart in ways concepts cannot. They slip past the walls of the intellect and plant seeds directly in the soul. Tonight, let me share a few stories, simple, timeless, yet powerful, that remind us how the practices we've spoken about come alive in real life. There is the story of a young monk who struggled each morning to rise for meditation. He loved the teachings. He wanted to grow, but the weight of sleep pulled him back to his bed. One day, his teacher found him still lying down after the morning bell and asked, "Why do you not rise with the others?" The monk admitted his weakness. The teacher smiled gently and said, "Then do not rise for yourself. Rise for the world. Rise so that one day, when someone else struggles as you do, you will be able to guide them." From that day on, the monk rose without fail. His discipline was no longer a burden, it became love in action. There is another story of a woman who visited the Buddha in grief after losing her child. Her heart was broken, her energy shattered. She begged for a way to bring her child back. The Buddha did not scold her longing. Instead, he asked her to bring him a mustard seed, but only from a house untouched by death. She searched and searched, but every home she entered had known loss. Slowly, she understood suffering was not hers alone. Her grief was vast, but it was also shared. That realization did not erase her pain, but it opened her heart to compassion, and compassion gave her the strength to go on. And then there is the story of a Zen master who was asked by his student, "What is the secret of enlightenment?" The master poured tea into a cup, filling it to the brim, and then kept pouring until it overflowed onto the table. "Stop!" cried the student. The master replied calmly, "Like this cup, your mind is too full of opinions and habits. How can I show you truth unless you first empty yourself?" The lesson was clear. Cleansing within and without is not just tidying life, it is preparing the heart for wisdom. These stories are not relics of the past. They are mirrors. Each one reflects a part of our own journey, the struggle to rise, the ache of loss, the need to empty what no longer serves us. They remind us that the path is not walked in theory, but in the lived moments of discipline, of compassion, of surrender. And perhaps the most important truth hidden in all these tales is this: wisdom is not something far away, reserved for saints or sages. It is here, now, unfolding in the fabric of your ordinary days. In the way you rise each morning, in the way you break old habits, in the way you forgive yourself before sleep. Each act, no matter how small, is a story you are writing with your life. And soon, as we arrive at the end of this journey, we will see how all these threads, intention, energy, discipline, reflection, are not separate lessons, but one tapestry. And in that tapestry lies the simple, profound invitation to live fully awake. And so, we arrive at the quiet end of this journey together. 10 chapters, each a stepping stone, guiding us deeper into the art of living with awareness. We began with silence, learning to enter the day not in chaos, but in calm. We discovered the power of intention, how a single clear thought can shape the direction of 1,000 actions. We learned to break free from unconscious habits, to manage not just time, but energy, to cleanse both our spaces and our hearts. We explored discipline as a gentle act of love, reflection as the doorway to forgiveness, gratitude as the soil where joy grows, and stories as mirrors reminding us of who we are and who we can become. And now, as we close, the lesson that emerges is simple yet profound. A mindful life is not a grand performance. It is built in the small, consistent choices you make each day. The way you breathe in the morning, the way you pause before sleep, the way you choose love over fear in the quiet in between. Buddhism teaches us that awakening is not somewhere far away. It is here, in this moment within you. Every breath is an invitation. Every sunrise a new chance. Every day a new story waiting to be written. So carry these teachings with you, not as heavy rules, but as gentle companions. Let them guide you, comfort you, and challenge you to live more fully, more compassionately, more awake. And remember this: the journey is never about perfection. It is about returning, again and again, to presence, to awareness, to love. If these words touch something within you, if this journey resonated with your own search for peace and clarity, I invite you to stay connected. Subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom, where each week we explore teachings, stories, and reflections that bring light into everyday life. May these lessons not just inspire you for a moment, but transform the way you live each day. And as always, may you walk gently, breathe deeply, and live fully awake.